So now that I've teased this topic in my previous video, and even on Twitter, I figured it would be instructive and ideally interesting to expand a bit on the idea of blind spots in Power Rangers. As we no doubt know, PR is a show with historically frantic production cycles, meaning there are a lot of different types of blind spots. But today, I'll be primarily focusing on the broader, more institutionally awkward examples that come off way worse than the Robo Knight rap ever could, even without being as clear-cut. But first things first, I want to make a slight adjustment to something I mentioned before about the writer's room in PR, as there has been one black writer named Denise Downer. She's also done some wonderful animated work on a wide variety of shows, and, specifically for our purposes here, was credited with 3 episodes of Beast Morphers. There's a couple videos of her talking about her perspective on her work if any of you are interested in learning more about that side of things as well. The original point I made on how the lack of racial diversity in these particular spaces creates some major oddities still stands, though not for a lack of some trying. But even still, I wanted to highlight this correction first, since not doing so would feel like erasing her contributions, which I would never dream of doing. And now that we've established that, let's dive into the heart of the matter. There's a lot of examples you could point to, and plenty of people have pointed to them. Zack and Trini being given the Ranger colors that they had is more of an amusing oversight than anything else, so conceptually, it isn't that far removed from the Robo Knight point. It happened, the optics are awkward for multiple reasons in the case of the latter, then the show moves on. It's not something that's especially intertwined into either season's DNA or narrative leanings, because despite what you may have been told, there is a lot more to both. So my intention here is not to focus on those more isolated moments, but rather the moments that feel a lot more ingrained in ways you can't just hand wave away, try as they might. What I also think is worth mentioning is that at a fundamental level, PR is often ill-equipped to handle most of their race-based implications because it actively avoids them while sometimes accidentally running headfirst into them. For all the on-screen diversity this franchise boasts, and full credit to them for that, you still run into situations where characters are written in colorblind ways, where their race and ethnic background are made not to matter, because they rarely actively inform the characterization. And I'd be the last person to advocate for that always needing to be the case, but consider this. In SPD, Jack's race matters, though not on purpose most of the time. But if Camille Hyde, Deborah Phillips, John Mark Loudermilk, even Erica Fong, among many others, were replaced in their roles by actors of a different race, nothing about those characters fundamentally changes, which delves into a number of production layers but is mostly just odd. So, now that we've set the table a bit, let's discuss Ninja Steel, but specifically their 2-part Princess Viera episode that really wanted to be the starting point for PR's worst recent trend. That being constructing these overly wieldy implications or entire plot points revolving around matters that either shouldn't be there, or should be handled with a lot more care and attention than a moral of the week. Princess Viera is emblematic of this, because unlike in the seasons of old, where her exact type of character would just be Rita's old buddy or some random off-world general, the actions of her government directly contributed to the situations Mick and Brody found themselves in. There is no reason to sugarcoat it, her parents are out-and-out slave traders within the confines of a galactic power structure that encourages that very thing. Ergo, why folks there were mixed on Viera's marginally softer approach even before her sudden revelation. I cannot stress this enough. It does not matter that Viera isn't seen to be, as far as we know, using her power to subjugate minorities specifically. That would have been bad, obviously, and then made even worse by way of the one black character here likely still not having any say on the matter. But even without any of that, it's just such an impossibly backwards and incredibly damaging idea in how it's presented. And this isn't some ye olde days fascination that educational systems can lie about the impact of, though I'm sure they do where she's from too. This is actively happening now, and is happening in a culture so rooted in it that their monarchy is the one keeping the system in place. This is the key element that keeps it fairly removed from the implications one could otherwise draw from the Captain Mutiny slave ring many years prior. That and, well, they murdered him. So with Viera, it's bad enough that the traumatic experiences of the past her family created aren't made to matter much, but it's much worse that a topic like arbitrarily owning those your people see as inferior to them is implied to be solved because one white savior showed her the light. Not that Sarah should even have been coded white since she's Brazilian, which goes right back to the colorblind thing we touched on. The only slightly saving grace to all of this is that neither this season nor Super Ninja Steel doubled down by way of Vieira showing up again, because we all know what would happen, right? She'd report in saying everything is just peachy keen because an entire galaxy of people raised to think differently have decided to just adopt her new mantras. At least with her going away for good, you can imagine that it's not going to be as simple as Ninja Steel really wanted you to believe, which is par for the course. There is a lot Ninja Steel really wanted us to believe that they themselves clearly didn't. Now let's pivot to Samurai. It's almost low-hanging fruit at this point, I'll grant you, but we can't not mention it in a video like this. It's just such a glaring blind spot to have the two Red Rangers here carry the same very Japanese surname of their Sentai counterparts. I'm not even saying you absolutely needed a Japanese Red for this story. Would that have helped? Absolutely. Especially with how deeply ingrained the Shinkenger elements are here relative to any other season and their Sentai counterpart. But I think at the core of it is there's an entire season filled to the brim with Japanese touchpoints, and the show doesn't really do anything important with it. There's no interesting conversations to be had about how this Japan-based team of non-Japanese people would naturally have less collectivist views. And the only reason Mike almost stumbles upon being that is because Chiaki was a better take on that idea. There is also nothing inherent to the story about the struggle for this team to adapt to all of this compared to what their parents might have gone through, half of whom took on this mantle. And that's just another issue with the adaptation of this material, since once again, Shinkenger had that and was way better for it, especially Mako. So if you are going to keep the idea of generational continuity that tends to be more relevant to Eastern cultures than the more individualistic West, then maybe do something with it. And even the smaller details that could have come about are missed. Like, why doesn't any ranger here, despite living in Japan, speak Japanese ever? They learn some calligraphy, but it comes off less like an important cultural touchpoint, and more like something Sakura threw in because it looked vaguely Eastern. Which is especially odd, because this team needs to be able to learn the importance of this ancient art to access their powers at all, which is what symbol power is. So the various scripts used over various dynasties, how it converges and diverges from its Chinese origins, and even just how the various materials are prepared should be important, but really aren't. I wouldn't go so far as some people and call it outright cultural vandalism, because not even Shinkenger itself was batting 1,000 on those marks, but at the very least, it's cultural dismissal. And again, this is one of the only seasons where that critique feels warranted, because it makes the active choice to tie itself so much to the original setting and plot points of the Sentai. So much so that Yasuko Kobayashi still gets credited for the original screenplay here, which, you'll notice, isn't something that happens for Kyoryuger's writer in Riku Sango as it pertains to Dino Charge, as an example. And all of that is on top of Mia being the only Japanese-coded person here, except her actress is Korean, and whatever the hell they thought they were doing with Antonio, whose actor is Thai and German. And regardless of what they could or couldn't change about the undercutting of Lauren's character, the additions they made are wildly uncomfortable, a discomfort that continues with some of Jake's actions, and with some of Ravi's actions. All this to say that Samurai, while not without its bright spots, is a season chock full of blind spots, ones that dig into the nature of its ham-fisted production in addition to the nature of its outward presentation. Now, before we talk about how this topic applies to Time Force, I'm legally obligated to state, for the record, that yes, I still love Time Force. Jen is a high bar for any Ranger, pink or otherwise. Wes might be the best Red Ranger ever, and the personal stories he gets almost exclusively vindicate that opinion. Trip and Katie are easily among the better Rangers in their respective roles. Lucas and Eric in many respects represents a counter to PR's usual slew of blind spots. They get him right in ways a lot of seasons would easily have gotten wrong. That said, the mutants functioning as an underclass in Millennium City's Year 3000 society is far too dense a topic for any PR writer to handle. I mean, it's a law enforcement agency specifically targeting a race, yes a race, of beings that would be considered just ordinary humans if not for being born with differences physically, which in turn grants them less social capital societally. It's not even hard to connect the dots there. If the mutants were any more disenfranchised, we'd be seeing future news reports about cringy 17-year-old former designer babies dressing up as them for Halloween. That having been said, every now and then, Time Force would make this work for them. Usually not in ways that really calls into question the moral framework of their own inbuilt practices, but still, there are really good ideas there. Which is why I'm not going to focus specifically on Time Force, but rather on Sins of the Future, because calling it not very good, as I have, is comically underselling it, pun intended, as always. Some of you have asked what I think is the most racist thing ever conceived in the history of Power Rangers. Put plainly, it's Sins of the Future, and it's not especially close. Everything that Time Force slipped up on in the season proper is exacerbated in this graphic novel, and all the while, Time Force's better elements are changed, devalued, straight up benched, or forgotten about. It'd be a pretty messy but fairly innocuous story if those were its only blights, but the truly vile idea of mutants needing to be cured in a society that values eugenics above all else is skin-crawling. And the morbidly hilarious part is that this story tries, but utterly fails, to alter that in-universe setup to shift blame away from everyone's favorite empirically racist genetic overclass society, and instead, they have this awkward patient zero setup with Venomark that makes zero sense, which in turn makes Time Force as an organization more culpable for the plight of the mutants, not less. And then the organization still isn't called to the carpet for it. It's embarrassingly hollow, and poor Nadira just has to sit there and take it, as the entire point of her character arc is ripped to shreds. I have an entire video that digs into the whole story for those curious, so I won't belabor the point too much here, but I consider this story the most disturbing thing this franchise has ever released, and I'd argue it's far more egregious than a lot of other problematic areas that exist. Not to devalue or dismiss PR's odd fascination with casual sexism, even in seasons very far removed from the ye olde days excuses. I mean, come on, it's 2025 and we're still pretending to be shocked that a girl can lead a team? If anything, the Alien Ranger on A-Squad should have been more of a focal point, given the nature of New Tech City. But if ever I had a role to play in that particular department, it would be to lift up the female voices in the fandom, who I assume would have a lot to say about that topic. So feel free to use this space to do so. To wrap things up, Power Rangers is great, except when it's not, which is few and far between on the whole, but it's always worth acknowledging when a franchise like this falls flat, because there will always be things they don't or even can't see. It's a franchise that has had very little variety in terms of decision makers, so these things are more likely. And even if this in no way impacts your view on various seasons, it's still a conversation worth continuing. And in the spirit of that, feel free to bring up things I've missed in the comments below, because the examples are far too numerous for a single video. And then next time, something slightly less serious. But until then, thanks for watching.